Thank you very much, Monica. I really would like to express my gratitude to you for inviting me to this extremely interesting conference. I will try to share my screen. I hope everything will work fine.
Yes.
Excellent. So let me just make my screen bigger. All right, so the title of my presentation is quite evocative and figurative, namely the biological and the digital, the ethics of healthcare in the digital world. But I will try to make a case for why talking about the interface between the digital and the biological today is no longer a domain of science fiction, but it's available domain of big enterprise and technological development, and therefore also something that requires to be investigated at the level of ethics and the law. There is a first minimal sense in which it makes sense to talk about the relationship between the biological and the digital in today's healthcare. And that is this broad phenomenon that we could label as the digital human, which is basically the possibility, the increasing possibility of using digital tools for the quantification of human biology. As I guess everyone in the audience knows, we now have available a broad variety of tools that can measure and monitor a great variety of parameters related to human biology, going from electrophysiology to data related to human behavior. These technologies are becoming increasingly cheaper, widespread, and uninvasive, so that can be used in an unobstructive way, to the point that we have already developed the first digital therapeutics, such as digital pills, which are pharmaceutical, contain chips, so digital sensors that can record information and transfer this information for further analysis, in particular analysis enabled by AI algorithms. So this is a minimal sense in which we can talk about the relationship between the biological and the digital, but it is also, in my view, a more narrow way to refer to this phenomenon, which is well captured by a few of technological development that are reshaping healthcare today, the most relevant of which is, in my view, the so-called brain-computer interface. So the brain-computer interface is technology. It's a neuroinformatic system that can establish a direct connection pathway between the human brain and an external computer device in a manner that bypasses the neuromuscular system. And the main characteristic of the brain-computer interface is that this channel of communication is direct between the digital and the biological world, the biological world being the human brain, and therefore human neurobiology, the digital world being a type of digital device that is connected to the BCI, be it a robotic arm or prosthetic limb, be it a computer cursor on a regular PC, like the one I'm using to give presentation. Now, first of all, why are we using brain-computer interfaces in medicine? Well, for a variety of classes of patients, especially patients with neurological disorders, such as patients who have experienced a spinal cord injury or patients who are recovering from a stroke. But in the last few years, brain-computer interfaces are used also for people with psychiatric conditions, such as patients with treatment-resistant depression, especially type of brain-computer interfaces that exploit also the so-called neuromodulation, so that use electrical activity not only to monitor the functioning of the brain, but also to influence it in a targeted manner. Now, why am I arguing that technologies such as this one urge us to rethink the relationship between the biological and the digital? Because here we're going beyond the simple, well, not so simple, but the mere quantification of the biological, the digital. But we're talking about now the functional integration of the digital into the biological. So artificial systems notably systems that embed AI capabilities, because the last generation BCIs use AI as a classification tool. Then this AI and the digital more broadly is incorporated functionally and sometimes also physically into the human neurobiology. This idea is not entirely new. The first conceptualization of the modern brain-computer interface dates back to the early days of computer science and biomedical engineering. GCR Licklider wrote in 1960 a paper titled Man-Computer Symbiosis, in which he hoped that in not too many years, human brain and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and that the partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought, and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we have today. So that was a quite accurate prediction from his side. As you know, the history of AI is full of wrong predictions. This one turns out to be one that proven to be true within a relatively short period of time. After 60 years, we have a broad variety of brain-computer interfaces that are already employed in the clinics, and as I will show later on in my presentation, that are now spillovering, that are being translated into extra-clinical applications as well. So given this, what is the task of science, and what is the corresponding task for ethics and the law? Well, the task of science is developing safer, more performative, and reliable systems to merge human biology and digital systems. There is an important need for advancing innovation in this field, especially to improve the well-being of millions of people who suffer from neurological, neuropsychiatric, and other disorders. And there is also a need to make these technologies more widespread and more easily accessible for people who need them. But at the same time, the corresponding task for ethics is determining under which conditions it is ethical to merge human biology with digital systems. Because this question may sound obvious, but we do not have established guidelines that help us determine under which circumstances this human-machine merge should be considered ethically legitimate. And finally, there is a corresponding task for the law and for international policy, which is promoting a science-based and ethically aligned approach to human-machine symbiosis, which favors the implementation of these technologies for the common good. Now, the good news is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are already fields of research in ethics that have been concerned with questions like the ones revolving around interfaces. On the one hand, we have the field of bioethics, which has been working on developing ethical rules for biomedical research and biomedical technology. And then we have a field of digital ethics that has been concerned with developing ethical rules for digital technology. In recent years, very important subfield of digital ethics was AI ethics, which is concerned with developing ethical rules for AI systems. What we're lacking, though, is a unified framework for the biological digital continuum, because as the biological and the digital will increasingly merge, and they're already doing so today, we may not have an adequate, unified, and harmonized framework for dealing for this kind of circumstances. Now, the ethics of brain-computer interface is a relatively new but very active field. Who are interested in the topic, I remind you to this article in Nature that came out a couple of years ago, which summarizes the work that my colleagues and I are doing in this field. In the interest of time, though, I would like to move to the ethical and policy aspects of this field and remind you that there are international organizations who have put the normative analysis and the governance of brain-computer interfaces at the forefront of their work. And one of those is the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which in the last 2 years has released 2 sets of principles one set of principles for artificial intelligence and one set of principles for neurotechnology. I had the privilege to serve in the committee working on the principles for technology. And one important part of our work was ensuring the harmonization between this set of principles and those that our peers developed in relation to artificial intelligence. For moving a step forward, this harmonized ethical framework for artificial and biological systems. So back to the question, under which circumstances is it ethical to merge human biology and the digital world? Well, first of all, we have to be aware that delaying potentially valuable technological innovation for people in need is not an ethically neutral stance, but something that can have detrimental consequences for millions of people suffering from diseases worldwide. This is particularly true for the field of neurological disorders, which they represent a major portion of the global burden of disease. And therefore, advancing innovation that can ameliorate the well-being of the millions of neurological patients worldwide is something that is inherently ethical. That being said, we are facing a few problems in this field. A first problem is the unclear efficacy and poor scientific validity of several devices on the market, especially those that are produced within the consumer industry domain. This is, I think, a very valid article, which I support, I endorse, by Anna Wexler, Peter Wiener, analysis of BCI systems available on the market, and they conclude that the little original research on their effectiveness, very limited horizontal translation of data from the research lab to the consumer products, and there's a lack of standards and scientific consensus on the safety and effectiveness of these devices. This is something we also encountered in our research. This is research that we conducted not on interfaces, but on intelligent assistive technologies for people with dementia. And we observed that a large variety of, that a slight majority of technologies in this field was conducted without validation through studies involving human subject. And we also observed that the large majority, actually more than 98%, was conducted in the absence of randomized controlled trials, which, as I guess you know, is the golden rule for clinical trials. So only 1% of devices was assessed and validated through randomized controlled trials. This is a problem because insufficient evidence leads to clinical uncertainty. Another problem we are facing is that the devices on the market today are not sufficiently user-centered, precisely because validation with human subjects is so rare. Most manufacturers do not pursue the so-called user-centered design approach, which is the approach to technology development in which you attempt to put the patient at center and incorporate the patient's wishes and needs into product design and development. And then finally, from a normative ethical perspective, Roberto Andorno and I, Roberto Andorno is a human rights lawyer at University of Zurich, have tried to identify the minimal ethical requirement, which we phrased in terms of moral entitlements or moral rights that can facilitate the ethically responsible translation of these technologies. And we identified three main normative ethical principles and two procedural ones. The normative ethical principles are the principle of cognitive liberty, the principle of mental privacy, and the principle of mental integrity. But we also address the importance of fairness in the access to these technologies and the incorporation of these ethical principles into the design of new technologies in a proactive manner. Let me unpack each of these principles. So cognitive liberty has been defined as a person's freedom to record, supplement, or augment their, let's say, mental functions using brain-computer interfaces or other techniques and to refuse to do so. So as you can see, it's both a positive and a negative moral right. What kind of scenarios may the principle of cognitive liberty prevent? Again, no scenario in the domain of science fiction, but already scenarios that are occurring in the world. For example, in China, workers are being requested to wear brain-computer interfaces that monitor their brain waves during daily shifts. And the collected data are then subsequently used to adjust the pace of production. And this is happening among high responsibility workers, such as the military and people in nuclear plants. Another question that is arising in the domain and relates to cognitive liberty is what happens when, instead of having external control by another human, such as in the surveillance case that I just described, we have an AI system that is incorporated into the BCI and can make decisions on behalf of the patient and therefore override the volition of the patient. This is a problem that we are facing among the so-called neuroadaptive BCIs, which are those that automatically adapt to specific aspects of the operator's mindset without any explicit input by the operator. Now, the obvious advantage of these neuroadaptive technologies is that you don't need to go to your neurologist in order to have the device calibrated at any time, but you have an AI that recalibrates the device automatically. The problem is, though, that this AI may generate a sense of estrangement in your sense of self, and may also hijack your volition under certain circumstances. And this is the reason why some colleagues of mine have written this article in Science, in which they argue that we should include a veto control function into any semi-autonomous system for brain-computer interfaces. This is also something that we will investigate in the next few years, because I mentioned that embedding AI into a BCI may generate a sense of estrangement. So the AI may partly affect a person's subjective experience. This is a conjecture that has not been studied yet. And therefore, we have created a consortium of researchers across 3 countries. And in the next few years, we will try to empirically, ethically, and legally investigate this hypothesis. Now, the second principle is mental privacy, which is the most intuitive among those I've listed. It's a person's freedom and ability to seclude their mental information and to prevent intrusion by third parties into their cerebral and mental domain. The example for which mental privacy can be potentially useful is very obvious. Is the use of brain-computer interfaces as a monitoring technology. Among other settings, this has been leveraged in the school and the education setting. What you see here is a trial that was conducted in elementary school, again in a Chinese, with the goal of monitoring the attention levels of elementary school pupils. The problem of mental privacy is particularly relevant, also in the light of the fact that all the clinical technologies that I've described so far are now moving towards the non-clinical sector, a variety of consumer-grade applications. Many communication and social media industries are investing in the BCI field. Facebook has launched in 2018 a BCI program for typing through your brain activity onto your Facebook newsfeed. And Elon Musk, as many people know, has launched a few months later a company called Neuralink with a business mission, the core mission to merge human brains with AI. Also in the field of consumer neurotechnology, we have conducted a study in order to assess the security and privacy standards of these technologies. And we have observed that most of them do use secure data sharing channel that use context-rich information, which in turn through big data analytics can be used to make privacy-sensitive inferences, including inferences from seemingly non-sensitive data, such as de-identified data. And this is happening without institutional oversight via RB or professional supervision, because, as I said, we are talking about consumer-grade products. And there is also an ancillary problem of limited traceability and auditability of data-driven inferences as a consequence of the opacity of the AI algorithms, and also of the fact that most of the software used in this field is proprietary software. Of course, we can leverage technological solutions, privacy-preserving tech, such as homomorphic encryption and the secure multi-party computation and differential privacy, but this has not been done sufficiently at this stage today. So more work on privacy-preserving tech is needed. The final ethical principle that I wanted to discuss is mental integrity, which is the prohibition of unconsented and harmful manipulation of a person's neural activity. This is relevant to any cybersecurity vulnerability of BCIs that can lead not only to data leakage, but also to a potential harm to the victim. And this is, again, something that has been proven through proof of concept studies in the experimental setting. And then the procedural principles I mentioned earlier are fairness, so ensuring a fair access to technology and a socially just allocation of its benefit. There are several ways to obtain this. People have argued that one way is prioritizing the worse off, such as neurological patients, older people, people with cognitive deficits, rather than prioritizing development for cognitive enhancement applications. What is very important, though, is that we should prevent the exacerbation of a digital and socioeconomic divide through health divide, so health disparity. And finally, we need to promote user-centered design. I'll skip one slide in the interest of time. But these ethical requirements and many more that researchers are working on should not simply be at the forefront of governance and ethical guidelines, but they should also be incorporated into product design in a proactive manner. And this is an approach that we're called proactive ethical design, which is an approach to technology development, particularly concerned with putting the patient at the center of the technology design and development process, and through this process, incorporating the wishes and needs of the patients into product development, including the wishes and needs related to ethical considerations, such as privacy expectations and so on. And then in an iterative manner, creating systems that are more calibrated to meet the needs of patients, but also more aligned with established ethical values. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I leave the floor to the next speaker.